The Man from Siberia. There is a photograph taken in 1916. It shows a man standing among a group of well-dressed people in what appears to be a drawing room, the kind of room that existed in the palaces and townhouses of the Russian aristocracy in the last years of the empire, all gilt and velvet and carefully maintained privilege. The other people in the photograph are dressed as their class required, the men in tailored suits or military uniforms, the women in the high-collared, corseted fashion of the era. The man at the center does not fit. He is tall and lean, with a long, unkempt beard and dark, deep-set eyes that look directly into the camera with an intensity that is difficult to describe, not aggressive, not threatening, but utterly focused, as if the camera and the photographer and the drawing room and all the carefully dressed people do not quite exist for him, as if he is looking at something else entirely. He is wearing a peasant's kaftan. His hands are large and rough. His hair falls to his shoulders. His name is Grigori Rasputin. He was born in a village in Siberia so small and so remote that it barely existed on any map. And he is standing in a palace drawing room in St. Petersburg because the Empress of Russia has decided that he is the only man in the empire who can save her son's life. This is where the story of Rasputin begins. Not with the murder that took all night, that has been described and embellished and mythologized for a century, but here, with this photograph, with this man who does not fit, who should not be here, who is here anyway. Let's begin. Grigori Rasputin was born in 1869 in the village of Pokrovskoye, in western Siberia, in the province of Tobolsk. Pokrovskoye was a small agricultural settlement, a few hundred people, farming the flat Siberian steppe, living the life of Russian peasants in the late 19th century, which is to say a life of considerable hardship and very limited horizon. The village had a church, as all Russian villages did, and the Orthodox Christianity that was the faith of the Russian peasantry, a Christianity mixed with folk beliefs, with the particular Russian mystical tradition that looked for God not in doctrine but in experience, in the ecstatic states of prayer and fasting and pilgrimage, was the dominant framework for understanding the world. Rasputin's early life is poorly documented. The accounts that exist were mostly written after he became famous, and they reflect the retrospective construction of a legend rather than reliable biography. What seems clear is that he was a difficult child, restless, prone to conflict, not well suited to the ordinary life of a Siberian peasant. At around 18, he spent several months at a monastery, an experience that seems to have awakened or intensified a religious sensibility that would define the rest of his life. He married, had children, and then, in his late 20s, underwent some kind of religious transformation. He became a strannik, a wanderer, one of the class of itinerant holy men who moved through Russian rural society, living on the charity of the devout, preaching and praying and performing what some of those who encountered them experienced as miraculous healings. The strannik tradition was deeply embedded in Russian Orthodox culture. The holy wanderer, poor, itinerant, possessed of a spiritual power that had no connection to wealth or education or institutional authority, was a figure of genuine religious significance. When Rasputin appeared in St. Petersburg in the early 20th century, he was not coming from nowhere. He was coming from a tradition that Russian society recognized and, in certain circles, revered. Rasputin arrived in St. Petersburg for the first time in 1903. He came, as many religious seekers came, drawn by the concentration of ecclesiastical authority and aristocratic patronage that the capital represented. He had already developed, in the years of wandering that preceded his arrival, a reputation as someone with unusual spiritual gifts, the ability to pray for the sick and effect healings, the capacity to enter states of intense religious ecstasy, the physical and psychological presence that those who encountered him found difficult to ignore. St. Petersburg in 1903 was a city in the grip of a particular kind of spiritual anxiety. The Russian aristocracy of the late Empire was deeply interested in mysticism, in spiritualism, in the occult, in the various forms of religious and para-religious experience that seemed to offer access to dimensions of reality that the rational, materialist culture of the modern West had abandoned. Séances were fashionable. Healers and mystics were sought out. The appetite for the transcendent was real and it was large. Rasputin fit this appetite precisely. He was exactly what the spiritually hungry aristocracy was looking for, a genuine peasant, with the peasant's presumed connection to the deep roots of Russian religious culture, who seemed to possess real spiritual power. The aristocrats who met him in salons and drawing rooms found him simultaneously repellent and compelling. His rough manner, his peasant clothes, his aggressive physical presence offended their sensibilities, but his eyes, his voice, his way of engaging with the specific fears and sorrows of the people he met, overwhelmed their objections. He met Bishop Theophan, one of the most respected ecclesiastical figures in the capital, who became his patron and introduced him to wider circles. He met the Montenegrin Grand Duchesses, the Princesses Milica and Anastasia, who were married to Romanov Grand Dukes and who were deeply interested in religious mysticism. And through them, he was eventually introduced to the imperial family. To understand Rasputin's hold on the Romanov family, you need to understand what the family was facing. Nicholas II and Alexandra Fyodorova had 4 daughters and 1 son. The son, Alexei, born in 1904, was the heir to the throne, the future emperor, the hope of the dynasty. Alexei had hemophilia. Hemophilia is a genetic disorder in which blood does not clot properly. In the early 20th century, before the development of blood products and transfusion techniques that could manage the condition, hemophilia was a terrifying and potentially fatal disease. Any injury, a cut, a bruise, a fall, could cause internal bleeding that could not be stopped. The pain of these episodes was extreme. The threat to life was real. And there was no medical treatment available in 1904 that could reliably prevent or control the bleeding. Alexandra carried the gene for hemophilia, a mutation that had spread through the royal families of Europe from Queen Victoria, Alexandra's grandmother, and Alexei had inherited it. The knowledge that their son could bleed to death from any minor accident, that each episode of bleeding was potentially fatal, that medicine had nothing to offer, was a constant source of anguish for his parents and particularly for Alexandra. When Rasputin was introduced to the imperial family in 1905, he was brought to Alexei during one of his bleeding episodes. And whatever happened in that room, the accounts are consistent that the bleeding stopped, that Alexei calmed, that the crisis passed. Alexandra concluded that Rasputin had healed her son. Whether this was genuine healing or coincidence or the calming effect of a physically powerful and psychologically compelling presence on a child in pain, Rasputin's ability to calm Alexei may have reduced his agitation, which in turn may have reduced his blood pressure and slowed the bleeding. We cannot know. What we know is that Alexandra believed it, and her belief became the foundation of Rasputin's power. The question of how Rasputin helped Alexei is one of the most discussed aspects of his story, and modern medicine has produced several plausible hypotheses. The most widely accepted is the anxiety reduction hypothesis. Hemophilia in children is significantly affected by psychological state. Anxiety and agitation increase blood pressure and heart rate, which can worsen bleeding episodes. Rasputin appears to have had an extraordinary ability to calm children, and Alexei in particular, through his manner, his voice, and possibly through hypnotic techniques. A calm child with controlled anxiety would have had slower and less severe bleeding episodes than a terrified child. There is also a possible medical mechanism involving aspirin. The standard treatment given to Alexei by his court physicians for his pain included aspirin, a drug that, unknown to the physicians of the time, interferes with blood clotting and would have made his hemophilia worse. Rasputin, who had no medical training, appears to have told Alexandra to stop giving Alexei the aspirin, possibly because he observed that the drug made the episodes more severe. If this is true, Rasputin's intervention was medically beneficial, not through mystical healing but through the removal of a iatrogenic harm. Whatever the mechanism, the effect was consistent enough that Alexandra was convinced. And her conviction, the certainty of a mother who believed that this man was the only thing standing between her son and death, was not susceptible to argument. The critics of Rasputin who pointed to his behavior, his scandals, his manipulation of court favor, found that their argument simply did not reach her. When it came to Alexei, she would hear nothing against Rasputin. The Russian imperial court's reaction to Rasputin was, from almost the beginning, hostile. The hostility took several forms. There was straightforward class revulsion. Rasputin was a peasant, rough and uneducated, and his presence in the innermost circles of the empire was an affront to the social hierarchies that the aristocracy lived by. There was religious concern. The Orthodox Church's official hierarchy was deeply uneasy about an itinerant mystic with no formal theological training having the ear of the Empress. There was political anxiety. Anyone who had the ear of the Empress had the ear of the Tsar, and the Tsar's ear was a very powerful thing to have. And there were the scandals. Rasputin's behavior outside the palace was not saintly. He drank heavily, sometimes publicly. He was associated with women, many women, in relationships that were not those of a holy man and his spiritual daughters, whatever he might claim. He visited bathhouses that were known as places of low entertainment. He got into brawls. He made enemies. The scandals were real, and they were used against him. But they were also, to some degree, exaggerated by his enemies, who understood that the way to remove Rasputin from the imperial circle was to destroy his reputation, to make it impossible for the imperial family to maintain their association with him without embarrassing themselves. The Tsar was periodically persuaded to dismiss Rasputin or to limit his access to the family. Each time, an episode of Alexei's illness brought Rasputin back. Each time, Alexandra's conviction that he was essential to her son's survival overrode the political pressures. The First World War transformed Rasputin's role in the empire. When Russia entered the war in 1914, Nicholas II took personal command of the Russian armies, a decision that was widely criticized at the time and that proved, in retrospect, catastrophic. By placing himself at the front, Nicholas associated his personal reputation with the fortunes of the Russian military, which were disastrous. And by leaving St. Petersburg for the front, he effectively left the running of the empire to Alexandra. Alexandra ran it with Rasputin as her advisor. The ministers who served the empire in the years 1915 and 1916 were appointed and dismissed at a pace that bewildered observers. Ministers who criticized Rasputin were removed. Ministers who accommodated him were retained. The quality of the appointments deteriorated. The business of government became increasingly chaotic. Alexandra's letters to Nicholas, which have survived and been published, show a woman deeply convinced that Rasputin's spiritual guidance was essential to the empire's survival, repeatedly urging Nicholas to follow his advice, attributing military setbacks to the failure to heed his counsel. The Russian aristocracy and the political class watched this with growing horror. The war was going badly. The country was under enormous strain. And the unofficial power behind the throne appeared to be a Siberian peasant with a criminal reputation. Something, they concluded, had to be done. The palace is bright with light in the December dark. In the rooms above, the Empress is writing letters. In the rooms below, a group of men are preparing. They have made their decision. They have their plan. They are going to kill Rasputin tonight. In part 2, we go inside the palace, into the relationship between Rasputin and the imperial family, into the nature of his power, into the world of the Russian court in its last years. Rest here. Let the winter settle around you. The Neva River is frozen. It has been frozen for weeks. Inside the Winter Palace. To understand what Rasputin meant to the Romanovs, you need to understand what the Romanovs were. Not the public Romanovs, not the ceremonial figures of Imperial Russia, the Tsar in his military uniform reviewing troops, the Empress in her jewels receiving ambassadors. The private Romanovs. The family behind the public face, living in a closed world of extraordinary privilege and extraordinary anxiety, shaped by the specific vulnerabilities and the specific loves that any family has. Nicholas II was not a man well suited to his role. He was kind, devoted to his family, personally courageous, and almost entirely lacking in the qualities, political instincts, decisiveness, the capacity to manage competing interests and powerful personalities, that the Romanov throne required. He had inherited an autocracy at a moment when autocracy was becoming untenable, in a country undergoing the fastest industrialization in European history, facing pressures that the imperial system was not designed to manage. He loved his wife and his children. He was not able to save his empire. Alexandra was stronger-willed than her husband, and it was this, her strength of will combined with her certainty about Rasputin, that made the situation at court so difficult. She had come to Russia from Germany as a young woman, had converted to Russian Orthodoxy with the intensity of a convert, and had developed a religious sensibility that was deeply personal, deeply sincere, and not well calibrated to the institutional realities of the Russian Orthodox Church. Rasputin, the peasant mystic, the direct conduit to divine power, fit her religious needs in a way that the official church could not. The relationship between Alexandra and Rasputin was, by all credible accounts, not sexual. This needs to be stated plainly because the rumors of a sexual relationship were central to the propaganda campaign against Rasputin and because they have persisted in popular culture. Alexandra's letters to Rasputin, which survive, are the letters of a deeply religious woman writing to her spiritual father, using the forms of address that Russian Orthodox practice sanctioned for such a relationship. There is nothing in them that suggests any other dimension. The relationship was, however, profound and unusual. Alexandra believed, with the conviction of someone whose belief had been repeatedly reinforced by apparent evidence, that Rasputin was a holy man with a special connection to God, that his prayers were heard in a way that others were not, that he had been sent to the Romanov family as a guardian and a guide. This belief was not naive or unintelligent, it was the expression of a serious and sincere religious worldview, applied to a specific situation. Rasputin, for his part, appears to have had genuine affection for the imperial family, and particularly for Alexei. Whatever else he was, and the accounts of his behavior outside the palace suggest that he was capable of considerable hypocrisy, his care for the sick child seems to have been real. But the relationship was also one of mutual dependence in ways that Rasputin understood better than Alexandra did. He needed her patronage. Without the protection of the Empress, his enemies in the court and the church would have destroyed him. She needed him. Without him, she feared her son would die. This mutual dependence gave Rasputin a security that most courtiers never had, and it made him very difficult to remove. The question of how much political influence Rasputin actually exercised is more complicated than the legend suggests. the legend portrays him as effectively ruling Russia in the years of the First World War, making ministerial appointments, directing military strategy, manipulating the Tsar through the Empress. This portrait is largely the creation of his enemies, who had strong incentives to exaggerate his power, and of later historians who found the story compelling. The reality is more nuanced. Rasputin did have influence over Alexandra, and Alexandra did influence Nicholas. But the chain of influence was indirect and its effects were often overstated. Ministers were not appointed solely because Rasputin recommended them. Military decisions were not made solely because Rasputin advised on them. What was real was the political damage that Rasputin's presence caused, not through his direct exercise of power but through the perception of his power. The Russian political class, the aristocracy, the reformers who wanted to modernize the imperial system, all concluded that Rasputin was wielding enormous influence, and this conclusion, whether fully accurate or not, made it impossible to maintain confidence in the government. The scandal of Rasputin's presence was itself a political fact, regardless of what that presence actually meant for the conduct of affairs. The political diary of the period, the memoirs and letters of the politicians, diplomats, and courtiers who watched the situation develop, records a growing sense of catastrophe, a feeling that the empire was being steered toward disaster by a combination of the Tsar's weaknesses, the Empress's certainty, and the Siberian peasant who had somehow become the pivot around which the Russian court turned. Those who met Rasputin consistently described an experience that was difficult to explain, an encounter with someone who seemed to operate by different rules, who had access to dimensions of the human personality that ordinary social interaction did not reach. The most commonly reported element was his eyes. Everyone who met him mentioned his eyes, dark, deep-set, intensely focused, capable of a quality of attention that made the person being looked at feel that they were the only person in the world. The effect is described in the memoirs of people who were initially hostile to Rasputin and who found, to their bewilderment, that their hostility dissolved in his presence. Whether this was a genuine spiritual gift, a highly developed set of social and psychological techniques, or some combination of the two, is impossible to determine from the available accounts. What is clear is that Rasputin had an unusual capacity to read people, to identify their needs, their fears, their desires, and to respond in ways that felt to them personally attuned. He also appears to have had a genuine gift for physical calming, the ability to reduce anxiety in agitated or distressed people through touch, voice, and presence. This gift was most clearly displayed with Alexei, but accounts of his encounters with other sick or distressed people suggest that it was a more general capacity. The combination, the penetrating attention, the ability to read needs, the physically calming presence, was the foundation of Rasputin's power. It was not supernatural, but it was real. Rasputin's enemies in the Russian court were numerous and, over the years, increasingly organized in their opposition. The campaign against him took several forms. There were attempts to provide Nicholas with evidence of Rasputin's behavior, his drinking, his womanizing, his exploitation of his access to the palace for personal gain. These attempts generally failed because Nicholas, though he found Rasputin personally distasteful, recognized that the attempts to remove him were motivated by court politics and did not fully trust the information he was being given. There were attempts to work through the church, to have Rasputin condemned by the ecclesiastical authorities as a heretic or a fraud. These attempts also generally failed, partly because Rasputin had some genuine supporters within the church and partly because the evidence required to support a formal condemnation was difficult to assemble. There were attempts by Nicholas himself to exile Rasputin from St. Petersburg. These succeeded temporarily. Rasputin was periodically sent back to Siberia, but each time a crisis with Alexei brought him back, and the exile ended. By late 1916, after 2 years of catastrophic war and the mounting chaos of the court, a group of men decided that the political process had failed and that direct action was required. They were not criminals or revolutionaries. They were members of the aristocracy, precisely the class that Rasputin's presence most offended. Their decision to murder him was, in their understanding, an act of patriotism. While the drama of Rasputin and the Romanovs was unfolding inside the palace, the world outside was undergoing changes that dwarfed anything that was happening at court. The First World War was destroying Russia. The military disasters of 1914 and 1915, the losses of men and territory that Russian armies sustained against German and Austro-Hungarian forces, were on a scale that the imperial system had no mechanism for managing. By 1916, Russia had suffered approximately 5 million military casualties. The economy was under enormous strain. Food shortages were developing in the cities. The social fabric that held the empire together was beginning to tear. The revolutionary movements that had been building in Russia since the failed revolution of 1905 were finding new energy and new recruits in the wartime misery. The Bolsheviks, the socialist revolutionaries, the Mensheviks, the various strands of the Russian revolutionary left, were small, persecuted organizations in 1914. By 1916, they were organizations with mass audiences, speaking to a population that was increasingly desperate and increasingly angry. Rasputin himself was aware that catastrophe was coming. His letters and reported statements from the final year of his life include several that have been interpreted as prophetic, warnings that his death would be followed by the fall of the Romanovs, that the empire could not survive the forces that were bearing down on it. Whether these were genuine premonitions or simply a reasonably intelligent man's reading of the political situation is impossible to determine. What is certain is that by December 1916, the empire had perhaps 3 months left. The conspiracy to murder Rasputin was organized by a small group of men, the most prominent of whom was Prince Felix Yusupov, one of the wealthiest men in Russia, married to the Tsar's niece. Yusupov's account of the murder, published in his memoirs, is the primary source for what happened on the night of December 29 to 30, 1916. It is a document that has been questioned and disputed at almost every point, but its broad outline, that Rasputin was lured to the Yusupov palace, that multiple attempts were made to kill him, that he proved extraordinarily difficult to kill, is consistent with the physical evidence and with other accounts. The conspirators included Yusupov, Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, a cousin of the Tsar, Vladimir Purishkevich, a right-wing member of the Duma, and 2 or 3 others. Their plan was to lure Rasputin to the palace under the pretext of a social gathering, poison him, and if necessary dispose of his body in the Neva. They believed that removing Rasputin would change the political situation, would allow the Tsar to be advised by rational men rather than an eccentric peasant, would stabilize the government, would perhaps save the empire. In this belief, they were almost certainly wrong. The forces that were about to destroy the Romanov dynasty were much larger than one man. The palace is quiet now. The conspirators are preparing. The servants have been sent away. The cellar room has been set up with chairs and cakes and wine, the wine into which cyanide has been stirred. The gramophone is ready to play, to provide the sound of a party for anyone who might be listening. Rasputin has been invited. He is expected shortly. In Part 3, we follow what happened that night, the murder that took all night, the story that has been told and retold and disputed for a century. Rest here. The Neva is frozen solid. The night is very cold. The murder that took all night. What happened on the night of December 29 to 30, 1916, in the basement of the Yusupov Palace on the Moika Canal in St. Petersburg is one of the most disputed events in modern Russian history. The account that most people know, the account given by Felix Yusupov in his memoirs, elaborated by subsequent writers and filmmakers, is a story of extraordinary, almost supernatural resilience. Rasputin was poisoned with enough cyanide to kill several men, and did not die. He was shot at close range, and did not die. He was beaten, and did not die. He was shot again, and perhaps again. He was still alive when they wrapped him in a carpet and threw him into the frozen river. This account has become one of the most famous stories of the 20th century. It has also been substantially revised by subsequent historical and forensic investigation, and the revised version, more prosaic, more complicated, in some ways more disturbing than the legend, is what I want to examine. But first, the legend as it was told. Felix Yusupov's account of the murder of Rasputin was published in several versions over the decades following the event, and it has the quality of a story that has been refined in the telling, shaped by the need to justify what was done, by the desire to present Rasputin as something more than human, by the psychology of a man who had committed a murder and needed to make sense of it. According to Yusupov, Rasputin arrived at the palace late in the evening of December 29th. He was taken to the basement room that had been prepared for him, a room decorated to look like an elegant salon, with antique furniture, a fire, and the food and wine that Rasputin had been told were waiting. Yusupov's wife, he had been told, would come down shortly. The food included cakes and wine that had been laced with cyanide. Rasputin ate the cakes and drank the wine. Nothing happened. Yusupov, increasingly desperate, went upstairs to consult with the other conspirators. He returned to the basement, where Rasputin was sitting, apparently unaffected. At some point, the timing varies in different versions of the account, Yusupov produced a revolver and shot Rasputin in the chest. Rasputin fell. Yusupov checked the body, confirmed it appeared to be dead, and went upstairs to report to the others. He then returned to the basement to check again, and Rasputin, according to the account, suddenly opened his eyes, grabbed Yusupov, and tried to strangle him, foaming at the mouth, howling. Yusupov broke free. Rasputin staggered up the stairs and out into the courtyard, despite having been shot in the chest. Purishkevich ran after him and shot him again, twice, with a second shot hitting him in the head or neck. Rasputin fell in the snow. He was beaten with a rubber club. He was still showing signs of life. He was wrapped in a carpet and driven to the Neva, where he was pushed through a hole in the ice. The post-mortem, conducted 3 days later when the body was recovered, found water in the lungs, which Yusupov interpreted as evidence that Rasputin had been alive when he went into the river, that even being shot multiple times and beaten had not killed him, that he had finally drowned. The Yusupov account has been subjected to forensic analysis, and the results are instructive. The first problem is the cyanide. The dose of cyanide that Yusupov claimed to have put in the food would have been lethal, if it actually worked as Yusupov described. Several explanations have been proposed for Rasputin's apparent immunity to the poison, that the cyanide was degraded or improperly prepared, that the sugar in the cakes neutralized the cyanide, that Rasputin had a genetic variant that made him resistant to cyanide poisoning. None of these explanations is entirely satisfying. The most parsimonious explanation, that Yusupov exaggerated the amount of cyanide used, or that he added it after the fact to the story, is not provable but is consistent with the rest of the account's embellishments. The wound analysis is more revealing. A forensic examination conducted on the basis of available documentary evidence suggests that Rasputin was shot at least 3 times. One shot appears to have struck him in the back, an angle inconsistent with a shot fired by Yusupov from in front of him. Purishkevich's shots may account for some of the wounds. But there is also evidence, based on the trajectory of a wound to the head, that suggests a third weapon may have been fired, one whose owner was not mentioned in Yusupov's account. This third weapon hypothesis has led some historians to propose that British intelligence agents, specifically a British officer named Oswald Rayner, who was known to be in St. Petersburg at the time and who had been a friend of Yusupov's at Oxford, were present at the murder or participated in it. The British government had strong reasons to want Rasputin dead. He had been advising Alexandra to push for a separate peace with Germany, which would have been catastrophic for Britain. Whether British agents were involved in the murder is not proven, but the forensic evidence is consistent with the hypothesis. The detail that has most powerfully sustained the legend of Rasputin's supernatural resilience is the water found in his lungs at postmortem, the evidence that he was alive when he went into the river. This detail has been questioned. The forensic pathologist who examined the body in 1916 did indeed find water in the lungs, and this has traditionally been interpreted as evidence of drowning, as proof that Rasputin survived the shooting and the beating and died in the Neva. But the interpretation of water in the lungs is more complicated than it appears. Water can enter the lungs after death in certain conditions. The body was in a frozen river for 3 days before it was recovered. The circumstances of the recovery and the post-mortem may have introduced water into the body. The pathologist who conducted the examination was working under conditions of considerable political sensitivity. The murder had been committed by members of the highest nobility, including a member of the imperial family, and the political pressures on the investigation were significant. The most that can be said with confidence is that the cause of death was the gunshot wounds, and that the specific sequence of events between the first shot and the body going into the river is not recoverable from the available evidence with the certainty that the legend claims. Rasputin was killed in the Yusupov Palace on the night of December 29 to 30, 1916. He was not unkillable. He was a human being who was shot, probably multiple times, and whose death was made more difficult than it should have been by the incompetence or the agitation of those killing him, and whose post-mortem story was elaborated and mythologized by the man who killed him. The murder of Rasputin did not save the Romanovs. This was the hope of the conspirators, that removing Rasputin would allow the Tsar to be advised by rational men, would stabilize the government, would perhaps forestall the revolution that everyone could feel approaching. The hope was misplaced. The forces that were about to destroy the Romanov dynasty were not primarily the result of Rasputin's influence. They were the result of the accumulated strains of the war, the economic crisis, the political dysfunction of an autocratic system trying to manage a modern industrial society. The immediate political consequences of the murder were minimal. Nicholas was outraged, not at the murder of a man he had found distasteful, but at the fact that members of his own extended family had committed it, that the nobility had taken extrajudicial action, that the conspiracy represented a challenge to imperial authority. The conspirators were punished, mildly, given their connections. Yusupov was exiled to his estates. Grand Duke Dmitry was sent to the Persian front. Others received lesser reprimands. Alexandra was devastated. She had Rasputin's body recovered from the river and buried on the imperial estate at Tsarskoe Selo. She had lost, she believed, the only man who could keep her son alive. Within 3 months of Rasputin's murder, the February Revolution swept the Romanovs from power. Nicholas abdicated on March 2, 1917. The dynasty that had ruled Russia for 300 years was over. Before his death, Rasputin reportedly wrote a letter that contained what has been called his prophecy, a statement that if he were killed by members of the aristocracy, the Tsar and his family would not survive him for more than 2 years, and that Russia would be consumed by chaos. The letter's authenticity is disputed, and the timing and circumstances of its writing are unclear. It may have been written before the murder, as a genuine expression of Rasputin's sense of the political situation. It may have been written or embellished after the fact. It may be a complete fabrication, attributed to Rasputin by people who found the retrospective prophecy irresistible. What is certainly true is that the Romanovs did not long survive Rasputin. Nicholas abdicated in March 1917. The family was arrested and taken to the Urals. In July 1918, in a basement room in Yekaterinburg, they were shot by Bolshevik guards, Nicholas, Alexandra, their 4 daughters, and Alexei, the hemophiliac boy whose illness had brought Rasputin into their lives. The house where they were killed was demolished in 1977 by order of the local Communist Party chief, a man named Boris Yeltsin. The prophecy, if it was made, was accurate. Whether it was prophetic vision or political analysis, it cannot be determined. Rasputin's burial on the imperial estate at Tsarskoye Selo did not long survive the dynasty that arranged it. When the Romanovs were deposed and arrested in March 1917, soldiers who had resented Rasputin's influence discovered the grave and dug up the body. They carried it to a forest outside the city, attempting to burn it. The burning of a human body with wood alone is technically difficult, and the accounts of the cremation are confused and contradictory. Some versions say the body was eventually fully burned, others say it was never fully destroyed. The ashes or remains, such as they were scattered in the forest outside Petrograd, as St. Petersburg had been renamed during the war. There is no grave of Rasputin. There are several locations in Russia that claim to hold some connection to his remains, but none of them can be verified. He came from Siberia and he returned, in a sense, to nothing, to the wind and the forest, to the landscape that had made him. Rasputin is dead. His body is in the Neva, or it will be when the servants find it tomorrow. The conspirators are cleaning the evidence. The gramophone has stopped playing. In the palace above, Alexandra does not yet know. In Part 4, we ask what Rasputin was, what he meant, and whether his story can be separated from the legend that has accumulated around it. Rest here. The Neva is frozen. The palace lights are going out, one by one. What Rasputin left behind. Rasputin has been dead for more than 100 years. In that time, he has become one of the most famous figures of the 20th century, more famous than most of the actual political leaders of his era, more familiar than the statesmen and generals and revolutionaries who shaped the century. His name is immediately recognizable. His story, the peasant mystic, the healer of the Tsarevich, the man who could not be killed, is one of the great stories of the modern world. It is also, in important respects, a distortion. The real Rasputin, the complicated, contradictory, morally ambiguous figure who actually existed, has been largely replaced by the legend. The legend is more satisfying than the reality. It is simpler, more dramatic, more amenable to the needs of narrative. The legend has a beginning, a middle, and an end. The peasant arrives, the peasant corrupts the court, the peasant is killed by the aristocracy, the dynasty falls. The reality is messier. The reality includes a man who genuinely helped a sick child, who exploited that help for personal gain, who was capable of genuine religious insight and genuine moral hypocrisy simultaneously. The reality includes an empire that was going to fall regardless of whether Rasputin lived or died. The reality includes the specific grief of a mother whose son was ill and who found, in an unexpected source, something that seemed to help. The question of who Rasputin really was has been answered in very different ways by different analysts, and the answers reflect the frameworks brought to the question as much as the evidence available. The religious interpretation sees him as a genuine holy man, imperfect, deeply flawed, but possessed of real spiritual gifts that the Russian Orthodox tradition recognized and valued. This interpretation takes seriously his roots in the Stranic tradition, his apparent healing abilities, the sincerity of his religious practice. The psychological interpretation sees him as a highly skilled manipulator, someone with unusual social and psychological gifts who understood how to read people and exploit their needs, who constructed the persona of the holy man as a vehicle for his own ambitions. This interpretation emphasizes the inconsistency between his behavior in the palace and his behavior outside it. The historical interpretation, the one that the best recent scholarship tends toward, is more modest than either of these. Rasputin was a complex human being who was shaped by specific cultural and historical forces, who had genuine gifts and genuine flaws, whose story has been distorted by the needs of those who told it. He was neither the demonic figure of early accounts nor the tragic hero of romantic rehabilitation. He was a man from Siberia who found himself, through a combination of genuine ability and extraordinary luck, at the center of one of the great catastrophes of modern history. The fall of the Romanovs has been attributed, in popular memory, significantly to Rasputin. This attribution is not entirely wrong, but it is significantly incomplete. The Romanov dynasty fell because Russia in 1917 was a country under impossible strain, a pre-industrial economy trying to fight a modern industrial war, an autocratic political system trying to manage a society that had been transformed by industrialization and urbanization, a religious and cultural framework that was losing its hold on a population that was becoming literate and politically aware. These were not problems that Rasputin created. They were problems that had been building for decades. The reforms that might have addressed them, the constitutional changes, the land reforms, the political representation that the moderate liberals and reformers had been advocating for years, were consistently resisted by the Romanov family and the class interests that supported them. Rasputin was a symptom of the Romanovs' dysfunction, not its cause. Alexandra's relationship with him reflected the family's broader tendency to retreat from political reality into a private world of mystical certainty. Nicholas's inability to manage the political situation reflected the broader failure of the autocracy to adapt to the modern world. The Romanovs would have fallen without Rasputin. The revolution was coming regardless. What Rasputin contributed was to accelerate the collapse of the political confidence in the regime and to provide a symbol around which criticism of the court could coalesce. The Rasputin legend has had an extraordinary cultural afterlife. In music, in film, in literature, in art, Rasputin has been the subject of an unbroken stream of creative engagement for a century. The 1978 disco song by Boney M., Russia's Greatest Love Machine, introduced Rasputin to a generation that knew nothing of the historical figure and ensured that his name and story remained in popular consciousness long after the historical moment he belonged to had receded. The film and television portrayals of Rasputin are numerous and varied, ranging from serious dramatic attempts to capture the historical figure to extravagant entertainments that treat him as a supernatural villain. Each generation has found in Rasputin something it needed, a figure who embodies whatever that generation's anxieties about power, religion, sexuality, and the uncanny require him to embody. This cultural persistence is itself significant. Rasputin has become a kind of archetype, the figure who comes from nowhere, who should not have power and does, who operates by rules that the established order cannot comprehend, who represents the return of the repressed. In a culture that likes to believe that power is rational and institutional, Rasputin is the reminder that it can be personal, mysterious, and beyond institutional control. The story that is easiest to lose in the drama of Rasputin's legend is the story of Alexei. Alexei Nikolaevich was born in 1904 and died in 1918, at the age of 13, shot with his family in a basement in Yekaterinburg. He was a child for almost his entire life. He never had the chance to become anything else. His illness defined his childhood, defined his family's relationship with Rasputin, and in a sense defined the political situation that contributed to the fall of the dynasty. The hemophilia that Alexei inherited from Queen Victoria through his mother is a historical fact with consequences that extend far beyond the Rasputin story. It was a genetic accident, a mutation that had spread through the royal families of Europe through the marriages that connected them, that shaped the final decades of the Romanov dynasty in ways that no political or military force could have predicted. The mother who would do anything to save her child, who would trust a Siberian peasant over the advice of her ministers, who would accept political damage to the dynasty rather than lose the man who seemed to keep her son alive, was not irrational. She was a parent in the most desperate of circumstances, using the resources available to her. Alexei died at 13. He never read the letters his mother wrote about Rasputin. He never knew the extent to which the man who calmed his crises had become the focal point of the dynasty's collapse. He was a child who was ill and who then, with his family, was shot. The Rasputin story is, at one level, a story about the nature of power, about how it is acquired, maintained, and lost. Rasputin's power was entirely personal. He had no title, no institutional position, no formal authority of any kind. What he had was access to the Empress, and through her to the Tsar, and what made that access possible was a specific relationship with a specific person who happened to be the most powerful woman in the empire. This kind of personal, informal power is extremely difficult to manage institutionally. The ministers and generals and politicians who wanted to remove Rasputin had no mechanism for doing so, because his power did not derive from any institutional source that could be revoked. He held no position that could be taken away. He had no formal authority that could be withdrawn. The only way to remove his influence was to remove him from Alexandra's life, and she would not allow it. The lesson that many of those who observed the situation drew was about the dangers of allowing personal relationships to penetrate the institutional structures of governance. The Empress's relationship with Rasputin was a private matter that became a public catastrophe. The boundary between the personal and the political, which modern governance tries to maintain, is always porous, and when it collapses the consequences can be severe. A man came from Siberia. He walked thousands of miles, as the Russian holy wanderers walked, looking for something he could not name in any place he had been. He arrived in the capital of an empire and found, in the grief of a mother and the illness of a child, a role that no one had written for him and that no one expected him to play. He played it imperfectly. He was not the saint that Alexandra believed him to be, and he was not the demon that his enemies depicted. He was a human being, complicated, contradictory, capable of genuine compassion and genuine manipulation, placed by the accidents of history at the center of events that were larger than any individual. He was murdered on a December night. He was thrown into the frozen river. He was found 3 days later with his hands raised above his head. Whether those raised hands were the last convulsive movement of a dying man trying instinctively to escape, or something else, we cannot know. The dynasty he was supposed to have ruined fell within months of his death, almost as if his presence had been the only thing holding it together, or as if his absence revealed how little had been holding it together all along. The empire is gone. The dynasty is gone. The palace on the Moika Canal still stands, it is a museum now. The Neva still flows. And somewhere in the memory of a century, a man from Siberia walks the long road toward a city where he is not supposed to be, where he will not be understood, where his presence will cause more trouble than anyone can foresee. He is still walking. Good night.